Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of SDR Insider Insights from Top Performers. In this episode, I'll be sitting down with Pat Burns, who started his sales career at Demand Drive in 2019, and a couple of years later was able to transition to his client's full-time team, where he's now a business development manager. This is a great episode that is helpful for anyone looking to move up into a manager-level role in the future. I'm super excited to talk with Pat and learn from his experience as his career continues upward. So let's get started. Hi, Pat. Welcome to SDR Insider. Thank you for being here today.
Hey, Maddie. Appreciate you inviting me on the show. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Obviously, we don't know each other, so this is me getting to know you as well as anyone listening. So I think it'll be a fun experience for everyone.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. So I would love to start with you just telling everyone a little bit more about yourself. You know, I know you were previously at Demand Drive as an SDR. We'll get into that in a second. But yeah, just a little bit about yourself, where you're from. I would love to hear just like a little more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everyone I don't know, my name is Pat Burns, from Marblehead, Mass. originally. So a couple miles north of Boston. I was at Demand Drive from October 2019 until about, I think I left in January 2021. But yeah, so I've been living in Boston for my whole life and went to school in West Virginia, and then have been back up this way living in Salem now.
Yeah. I mean, I love the Boston area. It's such a great spot. I was up in Vermont for a little bit of 2021 into 2022, and it was just so great. Like, we went into the city a lot, and it's just a great area, especially this time of year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, Salem is interesting. It's coming up on tourist season, so
I'm sure.
As soon as October 1st hits, people are dressed up, and the traffic is just off the charts.
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's a cool place to people watch, so it keeps it interesting for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. I wish I got up there around this time. I feel like that would be fun. But I would love to hear just a little bit about how you got interested in sales. Was it something that was always on your radar when you were in school, or did it kind of just pop up post-grad? Would love to kind of just hear about your experience with getting into it just initially.
Yeah, so I think first thing I'll say is that it wasn't my kind of first thought of where I was going to be after I graduated school. So I got into another industry. I was in real estate doing property management for a little bit. Did that for a few years. Found out, that's really not where I wanted to be long term. And so I think this is something that I did getting into commercial real estate, and something that I did to get into sales as well. So I think it's kind of applicable to a wide range of industries that you want to get into. But what I started to do is just have conversations with professionals in the industry. So at the time, I had some roommates that were a few years older than me. So I met with a friend of theirs. He, interestingly enough, was in property management, didn't like it, moved into sales. So I picked his brain and really got his 2 cents for what he likes about it, what his path was. And then having those conversations, in my opinion, what you're doing is you're building your knowledge of the industry, and you're also building out contacts in the industry. And chances are, I think by and large, people want to help other people getting into a new industry. So in those conversations, I would just be like, hey, I appreciate your time. Can you give me 2 more people that I could reach out to and set up a similar conversation? And so in doing that, I found out, hey, I think this is an industry, a direction that I want to go. And like I said, then you've built out a few folks that you can talk to, ideally long term, if you have more questions.
Right off the bat, that's such good advice to ask for 2 other people who you can talk to after that initial conversation. I haven't done that, and I think that's really good advice for anyone looking to make a career shift or just network in general. Because after that initial conversation, sometimes there's not much to follow up with. It's a little awkward. So that having that as an option to connect with other people afterwards that they recommend, that's a really good thought for sure.
Yeah. And like I said, people are like by and large willing to help. And especially if you're just showing a genuine interest, you're not really asking them for anything else other than what their experience was. People are usually willing to share about themselves. So typically they're really easy conversations to have, and people appreciate being able to help someone else out.
Oh, for sure. And would you say during that time period you were using LinkedIn a lot, or was it mostly people that you knew personally or maybe connections through friends and family?
Yeah, so I think I maybe used LinkedIn to follow some thought leaders to maybe get myself more familiar with some of the folks that are, like I said, thought leaders in the industry. But the conversations I was using more just word of mouth and going off the people that I'd already spoken with. So I think it was kind of a mixture, really.
Yeah, no, I definitely think people are more willing to talk than you would expect, especially as someone who's right out of school. It's a little intimidating to reach out to professionals who might have been in the industry for decades. But like I just said, I think people are a lot more apt to talk to you than you would initially think.
Yeah, and then the other thing is if you ask someone that you already met with to make an introduction for you, that's already a warmed up person. You're not necessarily reaching out to someone cold on LinkedIn. That might be a little tougher road to hoe. But yeah, going off people that you've already met with, it turns that into a warm handshake, and then connecting and growing that network just becomes that much easier.
Yeah, and that kind of goes off of what we learn as SDRs in sales is to use the people who you get in contact with and use that as your first step of connection, and to understand from there who is the decision maker, who do you need to be talking with, because it's not always that first person, but 9 times out of 10, that first person can at least get your foot in the door to someone else who might be the right person. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I guess that's a good pivot into your time as an SDR at Demand Drive, and would love to hear more about that experience. And then we can get into where you are now, because I know that you transitioned to work with your client, and I know that that is something that a lot of people aspire to do, especially if they have a project they like, a client they like. It's something that, is a goal. So would love to hear about your time as an SDR, and then we can kind of get into current role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, my time as an SDR feels like starting out, it was basically about 4 years ago now. But yeah, so jumped into Demand Drive. Like I said, didn't have any prior experience doing sales elsewhere. So really everything that they gave me was put that in my SDR kind of tool belt. They gave me all those resources to really get started and jump in. I was in the office full time when we started, and I definitely enjoyed that. Just having the ability to hear other people's conversations. You can hear what kind of tactics they're using. And then just the camaraderie of like, hey, we're all going to jump in and make 50, 60, 70 dials today. So really enjoyed the office environment at Demand Drive. And then there's definitely a sense of community for like, hey, like if you're new, asking like, hey, how did I sound on that call? Any advice for me, any feedback for maybe what I can do differently next time. And so that's great. That's great feedback to have from, I think, your colleagues at Demand Drive. And then also great to have from your client as well. I think they can give you more specific feedback for how to pivot and objections. But I think looking to your colleagues at Demand Drive for different strategies and broad strokes was something that I really liked. And I guess as a way of saying I would recommend getting in the office, or at least being in the same room as other SDRs at any point that you can. I think it's invaluable to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, for me personally, like I started during COVID, so I haven't had that experience. And, I think that I really have tried to call shadow as much as I can with people who have been here longer than me. And there's definitely ways around it, especially people who are still remote. But if you are in the area of wherever you're working, if it's Demand Drive or somewhere else, I think it really is invaluable to get in there and just hear other people have conversations, because even if it's not just a tactic, it might be a wording, or it might be something very small that you can implement into your own.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And even just like timing, like very little things that you really wouldn't be able to pick up on unless you're hearing someone else do them. And also, like you said, there are ways around it. I've definitely done call shadowing sessions over a Zoom call. So there's ways to make it work if you don't have access to the Demand Drive office or somewhere where you can get together with other SDRs.
For sure. And I think it's also just reaching out to your team members too, and people who aren't even on your team, but that you just know are successful and doing well, and not being afraid to do that, especially when you're early on in your career, because that's how you learn and become better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so going off of that, would love to kind of hear the process of transitioning from the SDR role to your role with your client and your current role, how you got there. Would love to just hear that story, and then, any advice you have for people who are also looking to do the same thing, and maybe they're with a current client they really like and they want to eventually work full-time for this client.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think when I started to make the transition, so I'd been working with this client it was a little over a year at that point when they asked me to join them directly. So effectively, the core responsibilities of my role stayed the same, but I think one of the bigger things that changed is I was more involved with the teams, like the marketing team or maybe the operations team, depending on what it was. So a lot of the core responsibilities stayed the same, and then I was really getting exposure to some of the other teams and resources with my client. And so I think if you're thinking about making that transition, I think a few things to keep in mind to really advocate for yourself is, I'd say just first off, be clear if you're interested in making that transition to work for your client. I think it's okay to let them know that, being upfront. And then also I think just finding different ways to add value. So thinking outside the box, showing that you're interested in growing your industry knowledge, as well as your product knowledge. So you think about maybe reading articles that your prospects might be reading. Think about maybe ask your client manager what resources they're reading to stay up to date in the industry. So I think just making sure that you're demonstrating a genuine interest. The next part I think is asking a lot of questions. Again, you're demonstrating interest in that you want to grow your knowledge base by doing this. I would always ask a million questions about the conversations that I had. So like the weekly one-on-ones, I found to be like a super valuable time spent. So basically just saying, hey, this is what I heard from a prospect. I wasn't able to navigate this objection. What's your advice for how I can do that better next time? So I think using those weekly one-on-ones or those weekly reporting sessions to get feedback for how you can approach situations on the phone better, I think that's huge, because I feel like there's sometimes where conversations are presented and not a ton of questions are asked. So I think using that time to get feedback is really valuable. And then I think also just asking for formal feedback from your client as well. Like, hey, is there anything that I can be doing better? Any areas that I can improve upon? So just having some time to, maybe it's like a 30, 60, 90-day review. Maybe it's like a monthly review. Maybe it's just like, hey, you just ask that question on your weekly one-on-ones. But I think just asking for formal feedback and if there's anything that you can be doing better. I think those are maybe just a few ways that if you're interested in transitioning to your client, might be good to keep in mind, just in my humble opinion.
No, yeah, I think that's great advice. And just to show your interest as well, I think it's hard because sometimes we think that our interest is known, especially when it comes to our client or whoever we're working with. But it is really important to just communicate. Like, that is the key takeaway, it sounds like, through transitioning for sure. And then also when it comes to transitioning, I'm just curious, was there anything that stood out as a learning curve for you?
So I mean, like I said, it wasn't when I made my transition, it wasn't like I was going from SDR to AE. So my transition was largely keeping the same job responsibilities. But I think if I had to mention any learning curve specifically, it was how to interact with those broader teams. So for me, in my situation, I was the only rep at Demand Drive. So it felt like had support from my manager on the client side, and then obviously my manager at Demand Drive. But just when you make that transition, chances are you'll have access to other teams, and just thinking about how to communicate with those teams, how they can be a resource for you, how you can be a resource for them. So just learning how to be a fish in a bigger pond, and really just be able to connect with those other groups in a way that's meaningful. And I don't think that's something that's necessarily going to be laid out black and white. I think some of that kind of comes with obviously the organization that you're going to work for. So just really thinking about meaningful ways to connect with the broader teams when you do make that switch. That was something that wasn't super clear, but you figure it out as you get connected and as you get more comfortable in the new organization.
Yeah, for sure. And then I guess going from SDR to AE, that's also a transition that people would love to make eventually. And I guess specifically when you're staying with the same company or client, what would you say that experience was like transitioning, and maybe some of those learning curves going from the SDR to AE position?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So my position's a little bit nuanced. So it's not like a formal account executive role. But again, so I think as you're moving up, learning how to delegate, I think is super important. So my relationship with Demand Drive, I was the person that was managing that role. So I went from really doing a lot of those cold calling, cold emailing, doing that outreach myself to then managing that relationship with Demand Drive. So really thinking about ways where I think normally you would probably just do those activities yourself, is really thinking about how I can delegate, how I can coach, how I can pass on what I've learned to the newer reps that I'm working with. So it's that, and then also again using the resources at the organization when you're transitioning into that new role. So really what I'm doing more of now is managing the middle of the funnel conversations. So it's less top of the funnel cold outreach and more talking with the folks that we've already engaged with. So it's delegating those cold calling responsibilities, being purposeful about how you pass on what you know, and then also looking for coaching opportunities from others when you're moving into that new role. So again, just asking questions, communicating, and then asking for feedback, especially in a new role, because you don't know what you don't know necessarily. But yeah, there's just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And kind of in the same vein, I guess, are there any skills that or lessons that you learned as an SDR that you feel like you still use today in your current role? Or things that you still do that you're happy, you took the time to perfect as an SDR?
Yes, I mean, I think one thing I got from Demand Drive that I still utilize in my outreach, because I still do some prospecting, I still do some cold calling, is keeping the mindset that you're calling someone based on research you've done, and then you have something that could genuinely help them. Just knowing that you're not calling down a list like a telemarketer, you've really done some research, you've spent the time, and you believe that whatever your solution is, your company is selling your product, it can genuinely help them. So I think that helps to keep in mind when you're making these phone calls. Because I know sometimes when you're doing cold outreach, it's, as we all know, being SDRs, it can be tough. Get a lot of doors slammed in your face, but just keeping in mind that you have something that could genuinely help the person on the other end of the phone is something that I learned at Demand Drive, and I definitely think about anytime I'm prospecting.
It's definitely that value add that is so important. And yeah, it's just you learn it as an SDR at Demand Drive, but then hearing that it still impacts your work as an account executive, it makes it feel very much worth it to do that extra work. Yeah, it's awesome. Okay, so going off of that, each episode I'm going to be asking our interviewees just some memories about their early days as an SDR. It can be a funny story, a crazy story, maybe a good story, something that really still sticks with you to this day, even as an account executive that, you think about from time to time. I would love to hear if you have any of those stories that you can share with us.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, something that came to mind is again, this is going back to kind of like the camaraderie of being in the same boat as other SDRs. And this is maybe something we were doing on like a Friday or like kind of end of the week sort of thing. But say you're having a slow day or maybe like a slow week, and it's like, hey, we're going to stick in the office until either I get a QC, till I get a really good connect, or I get an SAL. So like, let's all just like, we're going to jump in here. It's like a boiler room call session. Like we're just going to hammer calls until we get a QC or get an SAL. And just having that mindset of like, hey, like we're not going to leave until we get that done. And so I think that's just something like another mindset to be in is like, don't call to hit a number, call to get a result. So really just staying in the mindset of like, hey, like let's make sure we're getting a result before we walk out of here. And I thought that was just such a great memory that I had from the time at Demand Drive.
Yeah, that sounds really awesome and a really great way to bond with everyone too. It's great. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate all of your insights. I would love to hear from everything we just talked about. If there was one takeaway from everything we just said, is there anything that you would say to a current SDR who's looking to possibly transition to a full-on sales career in their future?
Yes. I mean, I guess final words for anyone that's moving from SDR and wants to continue their role in sales is, I think, clear communication. So whether that's with folks on your team, with the client, that, and then just getting consistently getting feedback from your manager. I think just being really transparent about where you are, and then asking for transparent feedback for areas that you can improve upon. And I think just those two things, communication and then asking for feedback, I think will take you pretty far.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I was honestly going to say the same thing. Communication was my big takeaway from this call, and, chatting with you. It really just shows how important that is. So thank you so much. And I appreciate your time. I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy listening to this and learning a little more about your process and your time at Demand Drive as an SDR. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Maddie. This was great.